Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Telegram, and Facebook. You can support me on Subscribestar, Locals, and Buy Me a Coffee, as well as checking out my Substack, where you can read articles that are both free and that have to be subscribed to read. And all of that is in the show notes below. So this is going to be chapters 9, 10, and 11 of commentary on Scientific Outlook. And it will be the last episode of the Scientific Outlook this year as I take some time off for the holidays. We will resume in January. Chapter 9, Science and Physiology. A living body, considered as a physico-chemical mechanism, has some very remarkable properties, which, so far, no machine of human construction can imitate. Direct quote, page 169. What's interesting here is, if you grew up like I did in the Oddies watching the Science Channel, you hear all these smug prigs being like, well, biological organisms are very poorly designed. So obviously the design argument can't be that good because we could design a better biological organism. As if anybody can design a self-repairing machine, which no one's designed yet. See, I suppose we could say that this is Russell talking about things before the rise of intelligent design argument. Maybe. That certainly probably has partly to contribute to that. Though I don't know if I think so. Well, I mean, Russell can disappoint in some big ways. So maybe he would disappoint in this way if he lived long enough to see this. But nonetheless, it's a good observation. And the other problem, of course, is seeing the human body as a mechanism. For certain ways you can. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because look at what happens when you do it. Well, okay, let me qualify. It might be useful in one sense, but not in the certain materialistic scientific sense we have now and what he's been going to be talking about. Maybe in the context of a spiritual science, you can believe the human body is a mechanism of some sort because it does have some properties like a mechanism, but of course it has much more. The point Russell is driving at is that the human machine can self-repair and endure higher stresses than machines constructed by man. Human bodies, Russell argues, have three properties: nourishment, growth, and predetermination. Nourishment is a chemical process whereby suitable inputs of food are turned via chemical processes into nourishment, with the indigestible parts being expelled as waste. Oh, let me get share screen up here. That would help people. There we go. And we'll just go ahead and turn off the camera here as we keep going. Okay. Growth is the idea that within the time dimension in combination with nourishment and cell division, the human machine can grow in size and bulk. Predetermination, which is a process where nourishment and growth combined keep the structure of the adult body more or less unchanged with limited plasticity as a child inheriting traits from the mother and father. This process. So, of course, in that sense, there's a combination of factors, but then once the combination of factors is solidified, not much changes. This process originates from reproduction and heredity. Nourishment is a chemical process which uses saliva as a solvent to make the energy in food suitable for transition to the bloodstream. Growth begins with the splitting of the fertilized ovum. Uncontrolled growth is cancerous. Predetermination, while expressed in heredity, is also expressed in repair of the body. Now, with this kind of breakdown, what's interesting here is the idea of, I mean, okay, for sci-fi purposes, a replicator, a self-repeating machine, gray goo, that's all well and good. That's fun, right? We can have that in a sci-fi story and not think about it too much. But if we look at these as mechanistic descriptions of how a human body grows and functions, even now, in the year of our Lord 2024, we're not even close to anything like nourishment. So most machines run on petroleum of some sort, natural oil or gas or petroleum or whatever. They're, are they gonna, in the same way that a human being eats food and then uses saliva to make it sellable, and then digest it and then put it in the bloodstream. No machine is even close to that today. Not even close. The idea of a solar-powered machine just doesn't seem to get off the ground. It's just solar power is not that good of a source. For motility, you still need petrochemicals. And that's a complex process to turn it, complex chemical process, once extracted, to turn into something useful. And no machine can just go to an oil rig and just drink it like water and turn it into something useful. Machines don't grow. If China and Japan have robot factories, but they don't build other factories. They build cars or other manufactured goods. And I guess you could say a machine has premeditation in the sense that it doesn't change much once it's finished, but it doesn't self-repair, which is what nourishment, I guess, does. We're not even close to any of this. And again, to his point, Russell concedes this, but in the aughts, the age of science, you had delusional, madmen saying we were on the verge of this, which is just patently absurd. Patently absurd. Anybody who looks at the process of extracting oil out of the ground knows that you're not going to have robots walking around like animals or humans doing this. First of all, the fact that nobody ever actually just sat down and did some mathematical calculations for what kind of energy you'd have to put in to make all this happen, yeah. I never saw it. Because it's all a joke. It's fantasy. It's just fantasy. Direct quote, within limits, a living body has the power of restoring itself to its previous structure when it has suffered some not too violent disturbance. Page 171. Again, absolutely correct. And no machine is even close to that. If a machine is damaged, a human being has to come and repair it. That's it. That's just how it is. Whereas, properly cared for, a human can recover from a whole wide variety of diseases. As of the writing of this book, Russell states that the science is applied to physiology only consists in prevention of diseases and prolongation of life. The only major change in modern times is that this knowledge has been used to keep us living longer in a state of chronic prolonged sickness to maximize profits for the food industry and pharmaceuticals. So this is something that I'm going to repeat as we continue with this. Russell just doesn't see how the profit motive distorts his own high-minded ideals of science. He just doesn't realize that people would intentionally keep the most of the population sick. Which from a scientific point of view of ideal human functioning, which just seems to be what Russell's operating from, of course you wouldn't do that. That'd be insane. Russell argues that with the exception of primitive races who use abortion and infanticide, the systematic practice of birth control on a population-wide scale is rare. He foresees a future state-controlled fertility, where cash bonuses are paid to parents to have more or less male or female children as the diminution or increase of each sex goes on. Okay, interesting commentary here. We see something very nearly like that in China, though that's liberalizing slowly. The idea of paying people to have kids doesn't work on a nationwide scale, as we saw in Europe. And he doesn't really talk about how you might have a sexual culture develop that requires large-scale contraception use, which is a form of, as I've said elsewhere, is a form of captured market, where once you have a certain sexual lifestyle where you have to have antibiotics and contraception, then you're just a built-in market. And then that's what we have, which isn't really state-controlled or state I guess it's subsidized by the state, because I think they subsidize abortion costs so they don't go up, with inflation like other things do. But Russell, Russell, like most scientists, expresses a ridiculous optimism in the degree man can control his own genetics via embryo manipulation. Again, anybody around in the oddies saw this. I'm like, this is just never going to happen. There's a built. Okay, so I've said this before, but like science has the actual claims that you can test in the laboratory. Well, actually, let's go back. Science, in the practical sense, can be one of two things. In a laboratory, testing theory with testing controls, or merely observation like a naturalist who observes the behavior of birds or cetaceans or wolves or whatever. Embryo manipulation is just nowhere. It's way out of there. And to continue with that theme, genetic engineering fantasies are fantasies. Man is not the kind of organism that can be controlled and programmed in this way. Neither are animals, for that matter. I remember well over a decade ago, there were idiotic speculations about a goat-spider chimera where the goat would be spliced with spider DNA to secrete spider silk in the milk, because spider silk is a high in tensile strength substance. For its size and weight, stronger than steel. I mean, you haven't no one's heard anything about this since. It's just completely been deep six. But I mean, again, I don't know, 2000 to 2014 or whatever, that was all over the news. Oh yeah, we're gonna have like goat spider chimeras. Complete fantasy. How would you even go about doing this? Hand waving, magic. Moving on. Direct quote. While it is rather rash to make detailed prophecies, it is, I think, fairly clear that in future, a human body from the moment of conception will not be regarded merely as something which must be left to grow in accordance with natural forces, with no human interference beyond what is required for the preservation of health. Page 176. But this did not happen as the result of the limits of technology. Technology does not give one that kind of power contra the ideologues. But also, this shows us the strength of social and religious conventions. So, for example, in Europe and the United States, inconceivable that you do this. A totalitarian country like Soviet Union or Communist China, maybe, but even they didn't do it, which indicates that it can't be done. I mean, it certainly wasn't for lack of a will. I mean, there were rumors of the humanzee, Stalin's chimp-human hybrid. It just doesn't work. It's just, again, it's fantasy. And the fact that sick people make corporations more money than healthy people. Yeah, he didn't think about that either. The tendency of scientific technique is to cause everything to be regarded not just as a brute datum, but raw material for the carrying out of some human purpose. Page 176. Again, very true, but this is where we have the sort of collapse of meaning that Russell's been talking about, the collapse of science as a metaphysic. And it's like, okay, well, which human and which purpose? As we read earlier, Russell says, well, it could be for human betterment or power. And since the metaphysical nature of science is faltering, it's going to be power that takes over. And he's right. That's what happened. And, it's surprising. Well, this is written before C.S. Lewis writes The Abolition of Man, though he does not interact with the abolition of man and the impact of science on society. As Lewis says, I mean, the handful of men that control these processes are going to control everyone, which is going to be terrible. This should be self-evident. But Russell only sort of hints at this. Chapter 10, Science and Psychology. This is interesting. Direct quote. At the period when I received what was in those days called an education, psychology was still to all intents and purposes a branch of philosophy. Mental events were divided into knowing, willing, and feeling. Attempts were made to define perception and sensation, and in general, the subject was one for verbal analysis of concepts that philosophers had rendered familiar, though not intelligible, page 177. First off, this education is based. Okay, classical education, based. The fact that Russell constantly retorts that theology and philosophy are unintelligible says more about his powers of comprehension than anything else. There's nothing incomprehensible about a classical education. This is just Russell showing his weakness as a thinker. It's just, and he had it. I mean, he had it himself. So it was very good at communicating certain things to people. And Russell just doesn't really like those things anymore, apparently. Psychologists, from Russell's point of view, in order to clarify education and make it scientific, sought to find something to measure. And this Russell approves, but in measuring the time intervals between salivating, he sees as the wrong thing to measure. Right? He doesn't really like rule of thumb or nuance. He likes this direct measurement. Psychology cannot and can never and has never claimed it could provide practical control over mental phenomena, according to Russell. The Jesuits were the first true modern psychologists. He sees elements of psychoanalysis and behaviorism in the movement, the two contending theories of his own day in the Jesuit tradition. In training the Jesuit adepts, behaviorism was used. In maintaining control over their clientele, they used psychoanalysis. He sees a Freudian slant to Jesuit psychology. The Jesuits were not truly scientific in that they did not care about the mechanism of their conditioning, but that their conditioning provided the proper result. A scientific psychology would be very interested in the mechanism aspect. Also interesting, Jesuits were some of the first modern anthropologists, with the accounts of the Iroquois in North America and the Aztecs in Mexico. So, psychologists historically ignored what was called non-rational mental processes, such as dreaming, hysteria, insanity, and hypnotism. He believes that this line of inquiry stunted the development of psychology. When people realized being mentally ill or challenged was not a crime or sin, the use of harsh physical measures was eschewed, and in turn the same methods were applied to the reasoning masses. Russell argues that in the insane, reasoning towards syllogisms is not the means by which they come to knowledge, but by acting on animal faith. Most men come to belief in the same way, though unlike the insane man, they do sometimes use reason. There are two psychological... Okay, so let's think about this. What Russell's doing here is... Okay, so prior to technological society, how did people form ideas? Well, I mean, the main idea was through reasoning and logic and all that stuff. But also, and this is important because we don't really do it this way anymore, through lived experience with our environment, right? That's one of the main themes of, and then in relation to other people. That's one of the main themes of Frank Herbert's Dune. The Fremen have this religious cultural practices based on surviving in the desert. It's not necessarily good or bad from his point of view. It's just how you best survive. But our material conditions are changing so fast due to technology that it becomes rather hard to do. And technology separates us one from another. So it's hard to develop these cross relationships. And so, yeah, I also think that in his case, the men who are insane are just men that, well, he actually has a little more nuanced take on insanity. So we'll hold up and wait till we get there. There are two psychological techniques, Freud and Pavlov. Freud is more therapeutic in nature. At a more advanced level, Freud seeks to untangle man's unconscious motivations, and we seek to remove the obstacles to them in our mind, which, if we put into practice, may or may not seem silly based on people's scientific level of knowledge. The distinction is between real and fantasy. Rather sarcastically, Russell believes this means real is whatever the analyst believes. True, very true. And fantasy is whatever the patient believes. This falls apart under close scrutiny, as reality just means the majority opinion, and from a psychoanalytic perspective, Copernicus would have been living in the land of fantasy. And that's in one part why I've always just sort of disdained psychologists. It's like, well, whatever I'm dealing with, I'm just going to be told I'm insane because I go against the grain. It's like, well, okay, you're insane. This is pointless. It doesn't get anywhere. It's just, a Mexican standoff. And again, sometimes you are the one man out, right? Let's say you're, Isaiah, right? Are you insane or are all the other Jews insane? Well, I mean, if you read the Old Testament, Isaiah's not the insane one. Or, a great, or in the mythic tradition, like think of Cassandra. Was she insane? No, but no one listened to her because they thought she was insane. So again, right? It's he's very right on that. That's a really good take on Russell's part. Quote, sane beliefs are those inspired by desires which agree with the desires of other men. Insane beliefs are those inspired by desires which conflict with those of other men. Page 193. Again, an excellent point, which I have nothing to add to. It's just a very good point. Russell hits the nail on the head. This is in part what... Okay, I already covered that. Russell argues that a good test of the truth of any psychoanalytic explanation is to see if the man in question puts his money where his mouth is. One is also a reminder to Mark Twain, who said, never expect a man to understand something his employment desires he not understand. Psychoanalysis has a psychological theory, consists in the discovery of the desires, usually unconscious, which inspire belief, especially in dreams and insane delusions, but also in all the less rational parts of our normal working life. Pages 185 to 186. See, this is something that I suppose in the modern context you can trace back to Nietzsche, who views himself as more of a psychologist than a philosopher, that not everybody actually acts on reason, which is what the Enlightenment wanted to do. It kind of strongly over-indexed into reason. But this is why modern psychology is fundamentally faulty and anemic. If you read ancient philosophers, medieval philosophers, everybody knew that we were motivated by instincts and desires. It surprised no one. Whether you were Greek, or Jewish or Christian, ancient or medieval. The thing was, how did you control those passions? How did you control those desires? Which modern psychology just doesn't tell you how to do because you're not supposed to. And so, yeah, this is just very limited. I mean, yeah, it's no great insight to see that people are motivated by unconscious desires. They're only unconscious because we don't talk about them, right? Aristotle talks about them. He has a list of virtues and vices, and the vices are these. Plato talks about them. So I don't know why this is right, but we've, I guess, moved beyond that, right? We're just better than that now. So whatever. Russell sees a great future for the application of psychoanalytic theory to education. Behaviorism, rooted in the work of Pavlov, is a kind of psychology that is the opposite of psychoanalysis. Quote, Freud starts from fundamental desires, such as sexual impulse, which he conceives as seeking an outlet, now in one direction, now in another. Behaviorism starts with an apparatus of reflexes and the processes of conditioning, page 186. This shows us the limits of Russell's comprehension. For the sake of argument, the two theories are compatible. No amount of discussion on the mechanism of action can explain why any given action is taken. Reading a line of code tells you why it does what it does, but does not tell you why it was used in the first place and for what end. We could argue here that psychoanalysis does that. Full disclosure, I'm not a proponent of either school of psychology. Russell prefers behaviorism to psychoanalysis, as the former is measurable in a way that the latter is not. Russell imagines that the scientific application of psychology to humans will lead to the use of drugs to deal with mental illnesses, and maybe even drugs that will have only positive consequences with the deleterious effects neutralized. Again, the sheer hubris of my science crowd is on full display here. First, there's no money in keeping people mentally healthy, so how did so many people of Russell's day not see this? Sick people buy stuff, like medicine. And then if you can manipulate them psychologically, they can buy a lot more. Having only positive drugs is also very difficult, if not impossible, to produce. For example, certain substances in nature found in food, such as the eucalyptus leaf, are toxic to most herbivores, but not the koala, who produces an enzyme to neutralize it. This kind of neutralization effects of toxins has still not been very well imitated by science. As usual, no mechanism for how science might produce this is provided, just hand-waving and magic. Testimonial, as long as I was trying to heal myself by using science products to heal the damage of science products, doesn't work. Because you just keep getting damaged further and further. This is just, this whole chapter on psychology, what's really incredible is he doesn't even imagine the idea that we might have a complete psychological breakdown as people are separated from each other, from nature, and from any sense of meaning. It's like he just doesn't even consider it. And I'm just like, wow, really? I mean, the literature, I wouldn't expect Russell to know about Lovecraft, but Lovecraft was already writing at this stage. Madness was a theme that was beginning to be explored as a result of these modern technologies, and especially war. One day we will begin education with the embryo by scientifically manipulating it. Again, this is nonsense. How could this even be done? Again, they were saying the same thing in the aughts, 70 years later. It's like, okay, exactly how are we supposed to do this? Magic, because, White Lab Coat Man says so. Okay, how is this not any different than the cardinal from the Roman Catholic Church rolling into town to tell you, hey, this is what the church says, now do it? Not at all, right? But these people who pretend to be anti-Catholic, well, they may be, in some sense, just recreated that institution all over again with a secular veneer. Quote, the power of psychological technique to mold the mentality of the individual is still in its infancy and is not yet fully realized. There can, I think, be little doubt that it will increase enormously in the near future. Science has given us in succession power over inanimate nature, power over plants and animals, and finally power over human beings. Each power involves its own kind of dangers, and perhaps the dangers involved in power over human beings are the greatest. But that is a matter that we will consider at a later stage. Pages 188 to 189. Now, It is true that technology then as now does give us power over these things. But you see, I think this is where what a lot of people falter, right? Right when you move from the narrow gamut of science of observing natural phenomena, so that'd be like naturalism, like birds and plants and animals, and then running tests in a laboratory, to this scientific metaphysic of like creation ex nihilo. Science is all about breaking things, and as Gandalf said to Saruman, he who breaks a thing to understand a thing is a part of the path of wisdom. Yeah, the state's also good at breaking things, like gearing up for a war. So what ends up happening is that because this power is extremely potent in one thing, like destruction, they think they can then turn it around to be creative. And there is a kind of creative destruction that occurs up to a limit, but it's not a fundamentally creative force. It's a destructive force, in that it creates new things by breaking things down and then reassembling them, which in some sense mirrors the alchemical process of breaking, the ideal of turning lead into gold by breaking things down into their constituent elements and rebuilding them. But this is kind of like a dark alchemy that just leaves a lot of broken and dead things in its wake. Chapter 11, Technique and Society. The application of science to social questions is even more recent than its application to individual psychology, page 190. Russell sees Malthus with population and Smith and Ricardo with economics as early applications of science to human society. This is not to say that Russell believes either of those theories were true, that they represented a fundamental change of mind. Russell then goes into a snarky critique of scientific racism that uses the application of Darwin's theory of survival of the fittest, which was used to argue that European races were superior to others. He claims this was also used to extend it to classes. I'm assuming here he's referring to the Soviets. He doesn't say specifically. Direct quote, all Darwinian writers belong to the professional classes, and it is therefore an accepted maxim of Darwinian politics that the professional classes are biologically the most desirable, page 191. Okay, again, that's Russell being at his best. He cuts right to the core of the issue. This is just the conceit of a certain class of people. Now, to be clear, though, I don't see why, other than for non-scientific emotional reasons, Russell could say that, oh well, it's not, it's morally wrong, or it's technically wrong to do this. But like even Darwin himself in the not The Origin of Species, the sequel, the Descent of Man, argues that it's highly injurious to let animals breed without having some person overseeing the strongest mating with the strongest, some kind of managed breeding of humanity is something that would be scientifically justifiable. And then furthermore, if we build civilization to protect us from natural forces, which are the things that are driving evolution, if you're going to make that claim, then you're going to have to argue you need to create synthetic pressures that mimic nature. Otherwise, you'll just go extinct because you won't be adaptive to new situations. A lot of times, like here, we see Russell kind of lapsing into his own prejudices and his own assumptions, which he hasn't critically evaluated. A good use of psychoanalysis here. Russell sees all this talk as politics using scientific technology to make the case sound more plausible in each context. So yeah, there's some good here, and there's some maybe missing the point. A good way to test a man's commitment to a belief is to see if he's willing to spend money on it. I might also add be willing to lose money for it as well. In either case, Russell is on the right track here. Russell argues that the advertiser uses this insight to get people to buy things. Seeking to create a state of mind in the buyer based on observing an ad is the goal, not to reason with him to buy a product that is meant to serve a need. He argues the medieval church might have used this method with more success and less open hostility in the form of the Reformation if it had used the power of advertisers. Most men believe things because these thoughts are reaffirmed. It does not really matter in what way, just that they are. In comes the ad man. Quote, advertisements tend, therefore, as the technique becomes perfected, to become less and less argumentative and more merely striking. So long as an impression is made, the desired result is achieved. Page 193. This brilliant insight by Russell explains the rise in what academic agent calls slop content. The slop is merely striking to get an impression in the audience, to then generate a response. Quote, the consideration brings us naturally to the subject of education, which is the second great method of public propaganda. Education has two very different purposes. On the one hand, it aims at developing the individual and giving him knowledge which will be useful to him. On the other hand, it aims at producing citizens who will be convenient for the state or the church, which is educating them. Close quote, page 194. This is undeniably true, but also inevitable. Even if we imagine an ideal scientific society that would make Russell happy, that society would produce citizens convenient for it, such as being able to interface with scientific technique and think in scientific ways to solve problems. This might lead to a Platonic noble lie where myth and legend are blended with scientific education for this purpose. The state only seeks to produce a scientific mindset in a small group of experts. The rest of the people are conditioned. Russell sees in his own day, by the power of scientific technique, as creating a new age of uniformity, making men less individualistic. The deep state dug its own grave with the internet. So yeah, when he's writing, this is long before the internet, and he's right. There was a homogenizing property. What ends up happening, though, first in a limited sense with television, which helped feed the culture war, but then really with the internet, a kind of radical individualism in the United States and throughout the world just started to spread. But of course, he didn't foresee the internet, and most people didn't, except for Forrester. So, and maybe some other people I don't know of. But the press in his own time was no longer an agent of free thought, but uniformity. This was because larger presses were favored economically, because with a larger circulation, a paper could charge more for ads and print each paper for less than their competitors in virtue of economies of scale. Niche presses still existed for niche audiences, but the opinions of mass man came from the large presses. The radio serves a similar role and aided the British government in the suppression of the 1926 general strike, as the radio was the only way to get the news and the government controlled the radio. Russell sees this same trend in the US, but not coming from the state, but big business. Very true. My forays in a sentence show this vividly. In his own day, cinema was king, though. Quote, the great majority of young people in almost all civilized countries derive their ideas of love, of honor, of the way to make money, and of the importance of good clothes from the evening spent in seeing what Hollywood thinks good for them. I doubt whether all the schools and churches combined have as much influence as the cinema upon the opinions of the young in regard to such intimate matters as love and marriage and money-making, page 199. Again, absolutely correct. Very true. Russell later quips that we should be happy our leaders use this method of communication to show us what is good, that good always wins in the end. And he's referring to Hollywood here. This was to do with the united front by Protestant and Catholic churches in the U.S. to fight smut with the Hays Code. So Russell is not really correct here. The filmmakers hated the code but had to go along with it due to external pressures and fear of government censorship. So during the Hays Code, they had their own self-regulating mechanism in order to prevent the federal government from getting involved. Using cinema as a weapon of moral corruption is explained by Ralph Peters in his 1997 essay, Constant Conflict. The problem is the rot hits your own country and you're also dead. So what Russell sort of saw coming and feared, Peters is like, oh, it's great, guys, it's great. Till you get here, where the United States is about to, hit the skids. Quotation, quote, it is undoubtedly an important modern fact in the modern world that almost all pleasures of the poor can be provided by men possessed of vast capital or by governments. Pages 200 and 201. Bread and circus. As people lose autonomy in their own lives, they seek more and more escape. This becomes a safety release so people do not rise up. Russell correctly predicts the future domination of U.S. Hollywood film worldwide. Russell waxes eloquent on how developments in science ended infant mortality and extended life expectancy. I would recommend a book written far later than this, Ivan Illich's Medical Nemesis. I think that was 1976, so this is like 45 years later. I'm not blaming Russell for this, but it's just a bogus narrative where he outlines this reality, better nutrition and sanitation practices, rather than say things like vaccinations, were the result of this. In the early modern age, the rise of the use of credit was a major step in the development of scientific society. Credit dominates men's economic life and indicates that even as of the writing of this book, the application of scientific technique to society was limited. He sees much ground for future application, and this he is very right. Russell sees all extant forms of technique converging into a single system, which he argues will lead to a world government and which is held up by nationalism. Again, not wrong, and we're actually seeing the reassertion of nationalism now in places like Russia, China, Iran, the Levant, and elsewhere. And yeah, I mean, a one world government led by a technological elite would be pretty terrible. I don't know why anybody would want that. Oh, it's inevitable, Todd. Well, right, if you say, but that's only if everybody believes it. If everybody were to fight you, it wouldn't be inevitable. So it's just kind of like a gaslighting. Quote, the social effect of modern scientific technique is, in practically all directions, to demand an increase both in the size and intensity of organization. When I speak of the intensity of organization, I mean the proportion of a man's activities that is governed by the fact of his belonging to some social unit. Close quote, page 203. Yeah, very, very true. These larger and larger institutions, government, economic, technical, that control us, leave us feeling isolated and helpless. Russell then contrasts the medieval peasant to the modern man. The former was far more autonomous in his life, and his connections did not extend far. The modern man must relate to organizations to get his needs. These two men live in totally different social worlds. Quote, scientific technique advances the most profitable size for most organizations increase. In a great many respects, national boundaries have become a technical absurdity, and further advance demands that they should be ignored. Close quote, page 204. Well, right, that's rather convenient, but for whom? We could also say this is vastly more true for the internet. Nationalism is bad because it slows down the formation of a world technological society. I mean, that's kind of the point, really. So why would anybody want this? The obvious, again, if you read The Abolition of Man, which again had not been written yet, but in another Russell book, it already had been written, it's totalitarian control. This is crazy. I mean, why would you want this? Any decent human being would say, no, we can't have this kind of control. And I think part of this is just that Russell was just so lost in the sauce on the technological progress arc. He doesn't seem like a person who wants a totalitarian society, even if what he's seemingly advocating here would lead to one. The chat. GF. I mean, taking care of people just on a health basis has proved, at least in infants, that they just die. I think Charlemagne, some Chinese emperor and scientist of the 20th century, saw the same. The rest gets deleted for some reason. I meant to say that children do not manage to live further and turn off results. Okay. Fun Smart and APCH, hello. So that's all we have for tonight. And again, this is the last commentary on Russell for this year. I will resume. There's one more regular show on Thursday, and but this will be the last commentary episode until next year. So everyone, thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis, the Price of Folly podcast, signing off.